Hi, I'm Alexander Maxim from PHP. Today we will continue our series about PHP. In this tutorial, we will learn the filtering, why we need to use filters. Firstly, what's the filter? In HTML, we can directly verify the value entered by the user. HTML5 has entered new type to test whether the value or the form of the value you have entered is correct or not. And we can use the title attribute to display a message directly for the user. But the problem is that the user can modify our inputs. For that, we need to check in the server, not in the client side. PHP gives a very good idea to verify the values is the filtering. It has two types, filter validate and filter sanitize. Today we will learn the filter validate, these elements, options and flags. Let's start with the filter validate email. What's the filter validate email? If we are in a registration form and we have an input for the email, to ensure that the user will enter an email in this input, we can use the email type in the attribute type in the tag input and the value on for the attribute required, and it will force the user to enter a correct email. But if we are with a developer, he can easily change the type of the email via text, for example, and the value that he entered will be stored in your database. It's a real problem. For that, we have in PHP the filter validate email, which will filter the email entered by the user if the email contains the sign at and if has the form email at email.com or not, and it will return a boolean value true or false. In general, this validates the email address according to the syntax defined by the RFC 822, with the exception of comments, padding with spaces and dotless domain names that are not supported. We can then return an error message for the person to enter a correct email. This filter has just one flag, filter flag email Unicode, and it hasn't option. Let's see how it works. So we are in the email. When the user enter the email, we are, for example, in HTML5, we will use the type email and the required on, and we will return an error message in HTML. For example, your email is incorrect. It's not secure. Why? Because the user can easily change the type of the input to text, for example, and he can write anything here in the input and send it to the server, and from the server to the database to be stored in our database. But using the PHP, we have the filter validate email. This filter will filter the value submitted from the client and will return true or false. If the value that the user entered is a real email, is a valid email, it will return true, else it will return false. So if the email is not valid, is just a string or a number or anything, it's not an email, it's not with the form email at email.com, it will return false, and we can return, for example, an error or a message error. Else, if it's true, we will store it in the database because we have a correct email. Let's see an example. Now we have a page filter.html. It's an HTML page. We have a form with the action filter c.php, and we have a table label email and input email for all the type of filters that we want to explain. Let's start with the email. The email, the input name is email. In the filter c.php, we will get the values from the $_post array with the name of the input, for example, email, and float for the input float, etc. Now let's see an example to understand the filter validate email. So we have the filter var method. This method accepts 3 parameters. So we have the value that we want to filter and the type of filter. Here we have the filter validate email. This filter has just one flag and it hasn't an option. So the filter validate email will check if the email that the user entered is a correct email. If it's a correct email, it will return true for the filter var, and the filter var will return true. So we will check if the filter var method is true, is not false. We will say to the user your email is, and we will print the email that the user entered. Else we will check if the email is empty or if the email is not a correct email, is incorrect email. Let's reload and see the results. And for example, when we enter 25, let's reload and you have entered a wrong email. If we say, for example, anything here and we pass enter, you have entered a wrong email. If we pass the empty value, we have you must enter a value, it's empty. And when we pass, for example, anything email at email.com, your email is email at email.com. So the filter validate email has checked if the email that we have entered is a real email, is a correct email or no. After that, we have the filter validate float. What's the filter validate float? If we need to do a mathematical calculation and we need only decimal numbers, for that we need to filter the value entered by the user. If he entered a value with a character, for example, or something else, so the filter validate float validates a decimal number and converts it to a decimal number if successful. It has the decimal option to select the decimals, and the filter flag allow 1000 flag to accept the comma as a 1000 separator and the point as a decimal separator. Let's see how it works. So we are in the float. When the user enter a float number, in HTML5 we have the type number. We can check if the value that the user entered is a number or no, and the required is on. We will return, for example, your number is incorrect. But if the user change the type to, for example, text, he can write anything here in the input, and this value can be stored in the database and can make a problem in your database. For that, when the value is in the server, we can filter it, we can validate if this value is a float number or no. For that, we need to use the filter validate float that PHP gives. The filter validate float has one option, which is the decimal or the list of decimals that we can select, and the flags, we have one flag, the filter flag allow 1000. So before using it, we can't use the comma as a separator of thousands, but after using it we can use the comma. Let's see how it works. So we have here the input of the float. We have got the float using the $_ and the name of the input float here. Then let's see how to apply it. So the filter var accepts 3 parameters as I mentioned. We have the float, or the value that the user entered in the input float here, and we have the filter, which is filter validate float. If this method returns true, we will print the number that you have entered is, and we will print this number. Else we will check if it's empty or the filter validate float has returned a false value or a wrong number. Let's see an example, and we have, for example, this sentence. When we enter, you have entered a wrong float number. When we enter, for example, 12, it's a float number, it's a correct number. When we enter, for example, 12.01, you have also the number that you have entered is 12.01. Now if we use, for example, comma 30 then 25, we will get an error. Why? Because the comma is an error. To solve this error, we will use the flag, which is filter flag allow 1000 as third parameter for the filter var method. Let's reload and see the results, and we have, for example, 12 comma 30 and 25, and we have the number that you have entered is 12 3 and the comma here 30 and 25. This is the filter validate float. After that, we have the filter validate int. What's this filter? As always, we are not sure that the user will enter a correct value. Always we think in the worst case. Imagine you have an input of age. The user will enter 25 and B. It will make a mistake. And for that, we still need to filter all the inputs. The filter validates int validates an integer, possibly in a given interval, and converts it to an integer on success. It has two options: the max range, or the maximum number that can taken for this input, and the minimum range or the min range, that's the lowest or the minimum number that the user can enter. And by default, it doesn't accept numbers in octal and hexadecimal representation. But we have two flags to allow the user to enter this representation in this input. We have filter flag allow octal and filter flag allow hex. Let's see how it works. So we are in the integer. When the user enter anything here, the type is number, we can return your number is incorrect, but the user can change the type of the number to text, for example, and he can write anything here in this input, and this value will be transmitted to the server and will be stored in your database. For that, we need to use the filter validate int to check if the value that the user entered is a real, is an integer or not. For that, this filter has two options: the min range and the max range. Imagine if we are in a registration form and we have the input age. For example, in the int we can't, for example, enter the letter A, but using the filter flag allow hex, we can enter the letter A as a hexadecimal representation. Let's see an example to understand it. So we have the filter var method, and we have the int, or the value that the user entered in the input int int, and we have the filter validate int, and we have the int array. What's the int array? It's an array with the options and flags. We can use this array here directly in this field, but to organize our code, we will use it here, and we'll make it in a variable, and just we'll keep this variable here. If we have just the flag, we can make it here as a third parameter to the filter var method, but if we have the options and the flags, we will use an array. So the array contains another array, which is the options. This array has two options: the min range and the max range, and the flags will be, for example, filter flag allow octal and the filter flag allow hex, like it. And now, if the filter var return true, if the value that the user entered is a number, we will print the number that you have entered is int. Else we will return you have entered a wrong integer number. Let's reload and see the results. And we have, for the integer, for example, we have 25. The number that you have entered is 25. When we enter, for example, anything here like it, we will get an error because this sentence that we have entered is not a number. So imagine if our input in the filter.html page is a number, like it, the type is a number, and we have the title, for example, is anything, for example, incorrect. And now in the int input, we have the input, but we can't write a string because the input number doesn't accept the letters. It accepts just the numbers. The user can change it easily by inspect this element and change the type to from number to text, and he can write anything here in the input and send it to the server. But if we are using the filter validate int, we will return an error. For a network, an IP address or internet protocol is a unique number that allows a computer to communicate in a network. This number has two versions, IP version 4 and IP version 6. To manually check the value that the user entered is very difficult. And for that, PHP offers a very important type of filtering, filter validate IP. This filter validates an IP address, possibly IPv4 or IPv6, and outside private or reserved range. It has no options and it has 4 flags. Filter flag IPv4. To filter an IPv4. The IPv4 refers to the version 4 of the Internet Protocol IP. This is the version currently the most used in the world to attach an IP address to a computer. The latter takes the form of a succession of decimal digits, for with IPv4 as 182, for example, .23.174.44. After that, we have filter flag IPv6. To filter an IPv6, the IPv6 addresses are 128-bit coded. The 128 bits of the address are divided into 8 groups of 16 bits represented by 4 hexadecimal digits and separated by 2 points. And for the last 2 optional flags, for doesn't allow private and non-restricted addresses. Filter flag no priv range and filter flag no rest range. Let's see how it works. So we are in the IP. The user enters the internet protocol, so the type is text. There is no HTML type to control the IP, like for example here the number. We use the filter validate IP to check if the value that the user entered is an IP or not. We have 2 flags. Filter flag IPv4 to check if the value that the user entered with this form is just an example, and filter flag IPv6 with this form. Let's see an example to understand it more. So the filter var accepts always 3 parameters. We have the IP and the filter validate IP. When the IP is correct, we will say the IP that you have entered is, and we will print the IP, else we will print an error. Let's reload and see, and when we enter, for example, this IP is correct. The version of this IP is version 4. Now we will add the version 4 as flag for the filter validate IP, and for that we will, for example, use 256.111. It's wrong. Why? Because the IP starts from 0 to 255. When we use 255 here and 111, it's a correct IP. Let's now enter an IP with version 6. This is an IP with version 6. When we enter in send, we will get an error because here the flag is v4. Let's use v6 and let's reload and see the result. We will paste the same IP and we have the IP that you have entered is this IP because the flag now is version 6. After that, we have the filter validate regular expression. What's this filter? The regular expression makes it possible to search for occurrences That's to say, a sequence of characters corresponding to what we are looking for, thanks to a series of special characters. To filter that the user entered correctly a regular expression, we need to use filter validate regexp. This filter validates a value with a regular expression. It has an option that's the regular expression to compare it with the string entered by the user, and it has no flag. Let's see how it works. So we have the regular expression. There is no regex type in HTML, like for example here URL. When the user enters the regular expression here, the input, we will use the filter validate regex to validate if this value is a real regular expression or no. It has one option, which is the regular expression. We select this regular expression and we compare the value that the user entered with this regular expression. If it equals or contains this value, we will say that this regular expression is correct. It has no flags. Let's see an example to understand more. So we have the filter var, we have the regular expression that the user entered, the filter validates regular expression, and the regular expression array, which has the options, which is another array. The regular expression that we want to do is 0 to 9. So when the user entered this regular expression, it will be accepted. Other regular expression, it will return an error. So when it's true, we will say the regular expression that you have entered is, and we will print this regular expression, else we will return an error. Let's reload and see the results. And if we enter, for example, the regular expression is from 1 to 9, it's false, incorrect regular expression. But if we enter from 0 to 9, the regular expression that we have entered here, when we click send, we have the regular expression that you have entered is correct, and it's from 0 to 9. After that, we have the filter validate URL. What's the filter validate URL? As we have a type email, we also have a type URL. We can use it and we'll check approximate the URL entered by the user. But to correct the URL, we will use the filter validate URL. This filter validates a URL possibly with required components. Be careful, a URL or a valid URL might not specify the HTTP protocol. So further validation will be required to determine if the URL uses an expected protocol SSH, for example, or mail2. The filter will only find valid ASCII URLs. It has no option, but it has two flags. The first flag, which is filter flag path required, by default the URL doesn't accept the form or of path, but by using this flag it will be able to accept this type of URL. The second is filter flag query required. Often we send information with the get method. If the URL will contain a request with the form interrogation point name, for example, equals Alexander, and that is not acceptable. To allow it, we will use this flag. Let's see how it works. So we are in the URL. When the user entered a URL, we have the type URL here in HTML. We have the title, the URL is incorrect. It's not secure because the user can easily change the type to, for example, text. Using the filter validate URL, it will filter and it will see if the URL is correct or no. We have two flags, filter flag path required. This is the path here, and we have the required, which is, for example, the interrogation point username is Alexander. Let's see an example to understand more. So we have the filter var. We will use the URL that the user entered and filter validate URL. Let's reload and see the results. When we enter, for example, anything here, it's a wrong URL. But when we enter, for example, like Facebook, we will get the URL that you have entered is facebook.com. Filter flag path required. Let's see the result now. When we click send, we'll get the URL that you have entered, so it's correct. And when we use, for example, anything HTTPS https facebook.com username Alexander, this query will get an error. To solve this error, we will use the query filter or query flag, and let's reload firstly and see the results, and we have the URL now is correct. Today we have learned what's the filter. The filter validates email, floats, int, IP, regular expression, and URL. Thank you for your watching.